time for another podcast. You are in for a treat. I have Connie Blaney, APR out of Oklahoma. She has over 30 years of experience in school communications. She actually started back in 1980. So we're going to walk through how she, through a connection, got her first job with Putnam City School District. She spent 15 years there and then got into Norman Public Schools with another 8 years there. We're going to talk about some of the changes that she saw, obviously the tragedy that hit with the Oklahoma City bombing and kind of how crisis communication has changed. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the importance of networking and getting involved, pushing yourself out of your comfort zone, right? And so that's going to be a really fun conversation. She's got a lot of knowledge and experience to share. And I think you're going to leave this conversation very inspired of what you can do as a school communicator, because you have the ability to reach so many people, impact so many. And so I just love this conversation. Now, I just got back from an amazing time in Chicago at the NSPRA conference, and we're going to talk a little bit about NSPRA. Everybody got inspired. You got a lot of teachings. I just want to say sometimes it's like, okay, now what? I just want to invite you into our Social School for EDU year-long membership program. We actually support you as a school communicator when it comes to social media and the changing platforms and getting trained and inspired and, continual learning and encouragement through our year-long membership program. And you can sign up now, get the support you need to really stay inspired, stay connected with people who do exactly what you do when it comes to social media storytelling. You can learn more at socialschoolforedu.com. I'd invite you to come over there now, get signed up. You can grab seats for 3 people for one low price within your school or school district. And you're going to get support, training, all of the things. And actually, some of those speakers that were speaking at NSPRA seminar will be coming directly to your computer through our virtual training program. So I love it. It's my favorite program, and it's the way that I really can serve you the best to help you do your job each and every day. So jump on over to socialschoolforedu.com. Now let's get into this week's K-12 PR tip. All right, today's little K-12 PR tip is in regards to managing your Facebook page. And I just am wondering, do you have direct messaging on your Facebook page? If you do, it's fine, but you have to be responsive. When people message into your page, they expect an answer. We're kind of in that age, right? It's changed a lot, like Connie's going to talk about. People just expect things faster. And we're finishing up our round of boot camp. And one of the things that we taught our boot campers is that it's okay to shut off messaging. You can go into your page settings and actually turn messaging off so that people won't have that option. And it's okay to do that because you only have so many hours in your day. And what we've noticed at Social School for EDU is many times people are asking questions that you don't have the answer for anyway. Hey, it's 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. What time does the bus get home for the wrestling team? You don't know that at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. You'd have to make phone calls, or they're asking some other question that should be directed directly to a specific teacher or a specific building. And so again, we want to be receptive and responsive and engage with our audience. But sometimes having all of the channels on really dilute our efforts to be proactive and celebrate our school and all of that. And how good is it if they do put a message out and we don't look at it for several months? That's not good either. And so I'm just giving you permission to take a look at your Facebook messaging and possibly turn that off. All right, now let's get to today's awesome interview with Connie Blaney, APR. Welcome to the podcast, Connie.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you were a little nervous with all the technology and everything, but we're going to have a great conversation. I met you in Oklahoma, correct?
Yes, at the OKSPRA conference in April.
Yes, and you have recently retired.
That's correct. I retired from my Blaney Communications, and of course, I'm retired from two different school districts. But I kind of announced my retirement, kind of stepping back from OKSPRA and NSPRA, still being active, but not so much.
Yeah. Well, you've got over 30 years in school PR, and you've got a lot of knowledge to drop with all of the people that are just getting into school communications or have even been in it for 15 years. I mean, you having that long of a career, you've got a lot of expertise and tips that you're going to share. So why don't you just kind of share your background and how you got into school PR and your career a little bit with our listeners?
Okay. Well, I graduated from Oklahoma State University with a journalism and English and education background and taught for a couple of years, yearbook, newspaper staff. And then a job opportunity came open. I stayed home 2 years with my son, and then I decided I wanted to go back to work. Someone that I went to college with, we were in photography class together. He had said that there was an opening at Western Heights in teaching journalism, yearbook, newspaper staff. And so when I went back to school, I liked it, but I think maybe I wasn't quite ready. But I had gone to a friend of mine who was a newspaper editor, and she said, Connie, there's an opening that I think you would be ideal for, and it's at Putnam City Schools. And that was the school district that I had graduated from. Putnam City is in northwest Oklahoma City, third largest school district of the state. And so she picked up the phone because I had done this internship with her at her weekly newspaper. And she called the superintendent secretary and said, I have someone you need to interview. So I went for the interview. I got hired in January of 1980. It was a brand new position for Putnam City Schools. A lot of the school districts were starting to hire someone, either part-time or maybe full-time, to do the communications for the district. It was kind of the trend then. And I was very fortunate that my superintendent knew we needed a communications person. My title was Public Information Director, and I served there for 15 years. And it was a great experience. And of course, I grew in the job. I was first hired. Back then, it was, can you do a newsletter? And a newsletter was a monthly newsletter that was sent out to the employees in the district and to key communicators in our community. And of course, writing press releases, being involved with the school board meetings and doing a board employee highlight about what went on at the board meeting. And as my job began to grow, I got more involved in school bond issues, community relations, news media relations. The thing was that since there wasn't a lot of full-time PR people at the time, the television stations called me a lot because they wanted news, and they had education reporters at the time. And so my job began to evolve a lot more into news media, working with the news media. Now, when I first started, I started on an electric typewriter. And I know a lot of your listeners out there saying, what? And I was one of the first ones in the building, and probably late 80s, to get an IBM computer. And I can remember people coming down the hall and saying, oh, you've got a computer. They were jealous, I think. But I started doing all my press releases and everything on the computer. And so that job did evolve a lot in those 15 years. And then I was kind of restless, and I decided I wanted to have a change. A job opening came in Norman Public Schools, which is about 35 miles from my home. And so I applied for the job, and I did get the job. And I was at Norman Public Schools for 8 years. And during that time, my job was a lot different, and then yet a little bit of the same. We had a school channel. We had our own individual school channel in Norman. And so we had a district show that I helped develop to where we did district news. We had lots of other shows as well on channel. We had a bulletin board that ran when we had students that did lots of different shows. You know, we had a sports show, and we had a music show for the music coordinators. But other responsibilities, of course, were still working with the news media. And we were just getting into web design. And we
Okay.
had a technology person that helped get that started. But of course, I was still doing a board report, but there was only a little quarterly newsletter at this time. People were beginning to talk about being more a part of the superintendent's management team. And when I went to Norman schools, I was definitely much more a part of the management team, became an advisor to the superintendent and to the other administrators on how to work with the news media. When we would have a crisis situation, I was in the room, to talk about, well, what are we going to do and how are we going to deal with this crisis?
Right. Okay. So you were at Putnam City Schools from 1980 to about 1995.
1995.
And then you were at Norman from 95 to
To
03.
2003. Correct.
Okay. And how big was Putnam City for enrollment?
Putnam City's enrollment was about 17,000 students. They next to Oklahoma City Schools, which was about 40, and Tulsa Public Schools, which was about 40.
Okay.
And then Norman schools, we only had about 12,500 students.
Okay.
And during that time at Norman, we also, when I first got there in February of 1995, they had an administrative community advisory council because they were going to go from one high school to two high schools. And I really applaud Norman schools on how they handled getting students to be acceptable to transferring to a new high school. We changed from two mid-highs to two high schools and went to middle school. So we did a lot of changing, but we had a lot of community meetings, got their input, but the advisory council, which was a representative of all the different communities, all the different schools in Norman, were a part of this. Parents that finally gave the recommendations of which areas were going to transfer to this Norman North and out of Norman High. And we did allow the seniors to stay that very first year at Norman High School. And we were surprised a lot of students wanted to go to the new high school.
Yeah. So in that 23 years that you were serving in the schools, and then I think maybe is that at the time in 2003, did you transition to your own company where you were doing independent work?
Yes, in 2003, I retired from Norman schools, and I was still in my early 50s. And I started my own public relations firm called Blaney Communications and PR. My main client, I had the executive director of the Oklahoma School Administrators Association say, I hear you're retiring. Would you come and we'd like to contract with you to do some of our public relations. So in that first year, 2004, I did a lot of their communications and public relations and worked with them a lot in that first year. Also worked with, at Norman schools, I was also in charge of the school foundation and partners in education program. So I had some schools districts that were starting to have a school foundation, and I might go out and kind of help them get started or tell them who they needed to contact, like the Oklahoma Foundation for Excellence, help them get started and steer them in the right direction.
Sure.
But after being home, even though I was busy I missed people. I'm very much a people person. And this job came open at Catholic Charities, and growing up Catholic, I was very interested in the job. It was called Public Information Director and Development. And I went to work there I applied for the job, got the job, and it was probably the best transition I could ever have. And having all that school public relations experience, it was such a smooth transition for me. Instead of working with principals, I was working with the priest. I was still working with the news media. A lot of those, I had an annual campaign to raise money for Catholic Charities. I've been doing that with school bond issues. So a lot of the things that I learned in school public relations were such an easy transition to a nonprofit organization.
Sure.
A lot of people came into school communications from maybe journalism or television, but I also heard a lot of people that went from a school PR job to another job. They were so far ahead in their experiences and their skills.
Yeah, that's awesome. So what were, besides your electric typewriter, which by the way, you guys, I learned in middle school, like how to type on an electric typewriter, which was a big deal then because we had the automatic, like I had a backspace that automatically deleted. And, a lot of people were still on just the manual typewriter. So that dates me a little bit too, but that's all good. What were some of the biggest changes from when you started back in 1980 up until just recently that impacted the school communicator the most, because that position has just evolved and changed and added. And you talked about right when you were inventing, kind of creating your first website, and then email came in that. And you talked about press releases. We don't do as many press releases anymore, it seems like, because of things like social media. So what were some of the biggest changes for you as you kind of reflect back?
Well, when I still attend the Oklahoma School Public Relations Association meetings and listen to all the new changes in technology, which were not a part of my job. And in some ways, maybe when you're working with the news media, that might have been a good thing, because when the news media would hear from something, maybe the students would, when they started having cell phones at school, they would start calling news media and say, hey, there's been a fight at Norman High School or something like that. But most of the time, they would call me first. Mm-hmm. And dealing with crisis situations really changed over the years. I think about all the shootings that have happened in the schools. And our biggest, I had just been on the job at Norman Schools for 2 months on April 19th of 1995. When the Oklahoma City bombing occurred. And the first thing the secretary did was, we were in an administrators meeting, and secretary of the superintendent came in and said, Dr. Gray, there's been some kind of an explosion downtown and the principals are already calling us. And a couple of years before that, there had been an explosion in a cafeteria at Oklahoma City Public Schools. So when I thought of explosion, I thought of a boiler. I didn't think of anything really big, but I had a television in my office, which was right next door, went and turned the television on and saw what was going on already, and the bombing and the building half empty. And so I called the administrators in and we watched what was on television. I called our technology person right away, and he got a list of every employee and every student in our district that had someone that worked in the Federal Memorial Building. And by 20 minutes, we had a list of everyone that had someone that might be in that building. And that helped us a lot. Plus, we contacted all the principals and said, let us know who you have. People were afraid. They didn't know what this terrorist attack was. They didn't know if it was an international attack. And a lot of parents came and picked up their children. And it was a pretty scary time. And we actually closed the school the very next day for a day. But I was on the phone all the time with the news media and, of course, watching what was going on. And I actually drove down, since I was in Norman and lived in Oklahoma City, I actually drove down by the building as close as I could get to see what was really going on. And when we went to the national conference that summer, we were in a crisis. I was in a crisis workshop, and afterwards they asked for questions. And I got up and I said, a lot of times a crisis can happen in your schools, but you have to remember that it can happen in your community. And for Norman, we were only one of 50 school districts in the metro area that had an employee, a mom, a dad, someone that was killed in the bombing. And it affected all the schools. And of course, the next few days, I was on the phone with all the school PR people in the metro area. What are you doing? What's going on in your district? How has this affected you? And we all helped each other get through that process. My next door neighbor, I was watching TV that night. My next door neighbor was on TV. His little boy was 2 years old and was in the nursery and had been injured in that nursery in the building. And fortunately, he did survive, and he's grown up, he's an adult, and he was one of the lucky ones. But it really affected our community. And for several years after that, I began to see more and more violence in the schools. And that became more what we were all about as far as dealing with crisis situations in our schools. So more a superintendent's advisor, more an advisor to the superintendent on counseling, working with crisis communications, and just getting more involved in our local chapter and national chapter on how do we help each other through these different crisis situations. I can remember the first session I went to when Paducah, Kentucky had a shooting, and that was one of the first shootings. And then, of course, Columbine. And so more and more we were hearing about these shootings and the violence. So that was something more we had to deal with safety and security. How do we ensure that our students are safe in the schools? So that was probably one of the biggest changes.
Sure. Yeah, I can't imagine being in that community because I still remember where I was when the Oklahoma City bombing happened. I remember going to school one day and seeing all of the pictures of the lives lost. And I visited that memorial that they have there in Oklahoma City. Certainly it just seems more and more has piled up in regards to what a school communicator has to deal with. And then I think, what you said at the beginning is, now our students have cell phones and they're getting the story out to the news media before we can even. And so I imagine that response time that you used to have back maybe in the 80s has just shrunk dramatically. Right?
Absolutely. For sure.
So having those plans is so key. So Connie, I love that your story of starting with Putnam City Schools really relates back almost to a networking piece of a job that you had and somebody thought you'd be perfect and they called the superintendent.
Absolutely.
And so I know that networking was really, has been key all along to, getting some of your contracts as an independent contractor, then getting your role with a nonprofit. But we've got some people that are just starting out in school PR. So what kind of advice can you give to them in regards to starting to get connected with either folks in school PR or in their communities, or what advice would you have there?
Well, I'd like to tell a story about my very first year at Putnam City Schools. I hadn't been on the job but 2 months when Frances Powell, a mentor, she was with Tulsa Union Public Schools. She called me and she said, Connie, you need to come to the OKSPRA conference in April. And now that you've got this job, you need to meet other school communicators in our state and get involved. So I did. My superintendent was very supportive of me being involved in both Oklahoma School Public Relations Association and the national conference. So after I went that first conference, I got excited and got connected with different people because networking is about your connections. And that summer, I went to the national conference in Washington, D.C. Several people had said, now you got to go to that conference. And it was a 4-day conference back then. And you've got to meet all these professionals from across the nation and from Canada. And that was just a wonderful experience. That professional development just opened the doors. And I came back so excited, made my connections. We had sign-up dinners, and I actually got to sit the very first night at the sign-up dinner with the president of NSPRA. Her name was Ann Barkley, and she was so inspiring and such a role model for me. And that night, the last night at the banquet, she did her speech. And being a woman, being very, very, very young, she was just an inspiration. I said, someday I want to be like Ann Barkley. And so those connections were important. And I think for a new person coming in, to get involved in your local chapter, if you're in school public relations, get involved in the organizations in your community and begin to become an officer. And then as I went along, I started doing presentations at the local chapter conference and also at the national. And it might be the first year just a round table where you go in and you do a 15-minute session, because everyone has their expertise. Even if they're brand new in the profession, they have some special skill that they need to share, and they need to have that confidence. So take a risk, get involved, become an officer in your local chapter, and then after you've had experience, start submitting a presentation to the national And it might just be like a 20-minute first session, but meet new people. When I went first to my conference, I tried to get a little bit away from my local chapter and meet some people at the national level. And that really, I think, helped expand my networking. You want to learn new things. And that's something I've always wanted to do, is just be, learn. You're always constantly learning. And that's really, really important. But get involved, become an officer, do presentations, and that way you're really beginning to network. Andrea, you're a perfect example of that. When you came to Oklahoma, you did a presentation, you were a sponsor, we got to meet you, and those are the kinds of things that are really important, is just be there and get involved and keep those connections going. Sometimes you have to be the active person to keep those connections going.
Yeah. Connie, would you say you are an introvert or an extrovert? Would you?
I think you could probably pretty much tell I'm an extrovert.
Okay, so am I. But there are many people in school PR that are introverts, so it's a little bit harder for them to get out. But your encouragement, I mean, it makes all the difference, because when you can meet people face to face and you share a meal with them, all of a sudden when you get back and you deal with, like we talked about, those crisis situations, there are people that already have advice. They have policies or guides that are able to share with you. And I have found, because I knew nothing about school public relations when I started this. And you probably didn't really, you had journalism background, so that was helpful, but schools are different. And so you learn by doing, and you learn by finding people that are smarter than you. You got a chance to meet the president of the National School Public Relations Association group, and you said you wanted to be just like her. Now, Connie, did you ever advance into a role within the national public relations?
Yes, I did. After 10 years, 1990, someone encouraged me. You were talking about encouragement. And I'll tell you who it was. It was Steve Nag, and he was South Central Region Vice President, and he was going to become president. He had been South Central. He said, Connie, why don't you run for South Central Region Vice President? It can't be anybody from Texas. So I thought, well, I think I'm ready. But I don't know whether I would have done it if I hadn't had some encouragement. And so I always remember how he encouraged me to run. And fortunately, I was elected, and I served on the board from 1990 to 93 as South Central Region VP. And that was the time when we hired Rich Fagan. Our INSPRA organization was going through some financial trouble. So I'm very proud that I was on the board that hired Rich Fagan as our executive director. And that was in 1990 to 93. And then several years later, I decided it was time, and I wanted to run for INSPRA president. And there was a campaign, but I was very fortunate and got elected in 1990-93. Served on the board for 2 years, 1 year as president-elect, and then 1 year as president, 1999-2000. Awesome. And that was a great experience. That's something also that's really a wonderful thing about getting involved, is you learn new things when you're on a board that I did not know necessarily in my regular job.
Right. Oh, that's incredible. And I love your encouragement for presentations. And, a lot of times, even for guests of this podcast, and even you, Connie, we're like, well, what am I going to share? It's like, oh my gosh, every person that has experiences it's going to be valuable for people to learn from them. And so whether you're brand new to school PR and can talk about those initial first building relationships, whether you're new to school PR, but oh my gosh, Instagram is like your jam, and you can share how you've really been killing it on Instagram with your schools. There's always something, and it's a little bit out of your comfort zone. Although to me, Connie, like, I swear I was born to be on a stage. So I love presenting, and that's just really fires me up. But it can be intimidating when you're presenting with your peers. But just knowing that you are getting out there and sharing your experiences, you're fostering a further conversation. Just get involved at those state chapters, which we'll make sure to give a link in the show notes to both the National School Public Relations association. And then they also have a state chapter list.
Mhm.
And so we'd love for you to get involved. The national seminar is every summer in July. So that just ended. But you can sign up pretty soon, probably for, I think the next one is in St. Louis, Missouri. So you can certainly make plans to do it there. But I love your encouragement of just kind of getting involved. And I'm sure those networks, those relationships that you made, you were able to carry them through the rest of your career.
Well, absolutely. And I remember the encouragement that I received. I thought that's something I need to do as well. And so I began to, for example, when I was the South Central Region Vice President, I tried to visit every single state while I was in that 3-year period. And I would see leadership qualities in people. And they maybe were doing a presentation at that chapter conference or something. And I'd go up to them afterwards. Have you ever thought about running for regional vice president? Or have you ever thought about running for president of the national organization? I think you would do a great job. And I found that it made me feel good to encourage others. And I saw a lot of leadership qualities in some of these people. So no matter what, even if you're brand new in the profession, you do have something to share, and just take a little bit of a risk and maybe talk to the president of that chapter or that you would like to share. Maybe be a panel. If you're a little nervous about doing one all by yourself, do it as a panel. Say, hey, let's do a session together on what we're doing on social engagement or what we're doing in bond issues and how we just, around the community. So that's a good way to start, but be visible, because you're not only being visible for yourself, you're promoting your school district, you're promoting your organization, as well as that's one of the main things that you want to do. You want to promote. People began to know where Norman Public Schools was. And in fact, I invited some of the directors of our studio to come and do a presentation on our Channel 29 at Norman Schools. So you can spotlight other people in your district by getting them involved in doing a presentation.
Yeah, I love it. And it's all going to build your confidence. It's going to build your leadership, maybe within your state, but also just within your school. So think about that.
Yes.
So our time is really flying by, Connie. So I'm just going to kind of wrap up with, we talk about networking, professional development, and you kind of talked about always learning. So what kind of advice do you have there in regards to some of those professional learning steps? Because you obviously, throughout your career, you had to learn a lot of things and be committed and open to those. So what advice would you have there?
Well, one of the things I do want to mention is, if you have not gotten your accreditation, your APR, to try to do that. It was 15 years before I actually decided to get my APR. But we were fortunate in Oklahoma. We had a course all year long, and 20 of us got involved. And of course, we invited experts to come in. So accreditation is one thing that I would think about. And you might want to do it with a couple of your colleagues in your organization. And I went back to school. I'd always wanted to get my master's degree. And so people might think about getting an advanced degree if they don't have it. I didn't get my advanced degree until I was working at Catholic Charities. It was a 2-year cohort program at the University of Oklahoma. And it was called Masters of Arts in Education and Community Renewal. And I thought, maybe I'm too old to do this. And she said, well, you're in your 50s. You're not too old to go back and get your master's degree. Now, it's hanging above my wall here, but I had it, it was setting a goal. So I think in professional development, you need to set your goals, and they might be small at first, but always keep learning, and professional development comes in a lot of different ways. So it could be a community organization as well as, school public relations association or something like that.
The best investment that you can make is in yourself, right?
Absolutely.
I always said this, and I said this when I started my business, is like, if I was going to bet on anybody, like, I'd bet on me. And so you just need to have that belief in yourself, and just knowing that sometimes it's scary. It costs money. It costs time. You've already got a job on your plate. But when you can push yourself out, like you said, set some small goals, maybe set some bigger goals, and be connected again, back to the networking of other people who have done it that you can learn from and kind of gain some insight from. So I love it. It's been so fun talking with you, Connie. What's the best way for our listeners to stay connected to you?
Well, probably the best way is email,
Okay.
and if they're an INSPRA member, through the INSPRA directory. My information is on there about my email, and if you'll put that in there, that would
Yes, I'll
probably
put
be
your email in the show notes. So you guys,
okay.
if you want to reach out to Connie to chat with her, get some more insight. I love that you took the time to share with everyone. I just applaud you on
Well, thank you,
your.
Andrea. I applaud you too. You're doing a great job. Keep it up. You're a great interviewer,
Oh,
and I'm just so proud of you that you have so many podcasts already under your belt.
I am good
Good
at
job.
talking, Connie. So it is, and I am so I've got so much to learn. This is actually part of my professional development, right? Is getting to talk with folks and then bringing them on and getting it to share with more people than just me. But love what you've done. Putnam City Schools, Norman Public Schools was lucky to have you, the Catholic charity. Like you
Thank you.
kind of really open it up to all the possibilities, you guys, that you have in a school communicator communications role. And you made such an impact, Connie, and I know that our listeners are going to do the same. So I love that you paid it forward with some advice today.
Well, thank you so much, Andrea. I enjoyed it very much.
Yes,
God
awesome. And
bless.
thanks everybody for listening. We'll see you again next week, same time, same place. Bye-bye.
Bye.